Hello, freak bitches, and welcome to another episode of DracCast. I'm your host, Joe Rogan, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Rob Schneider, and my other co-host, Dan Schneider. Say hello, guys.
I really feel like I don't want the Democratic Party trying to run my life.
I would not put this on the tube.
You guys are really funny. Anyway, today I'm going to be talking about two very special stories. And when I say stories, I should note that this is the first episode of this show that is not about a work of, like, a film or a TV show episode or a TV show in general. This is entirely about two works of prose fiction and their respective graphic novel adaptations as well. I'll get to that when I get to it. But these are both by a writer who probably everyone knows, because in the world that me and I think everyone who listens to this show occupies, he's like one of the bigger names to the extent that he's well known outside of like our community. I mean, he was on Arthur. He's on The Simpsons. He's been interviewed on late night TV. So, you know, he is a science fiction, fantasy, comic book writer, but he's one of the ones who's more well known outside of that community. And I'm, of course, talking about Neil Gaiman. So, Neil Gaiman, obviously everyone knows him. He's got big curly hair. He is British. He made Sandman and also American Gods and a bunch of stuff like that. He's sort of Alan Moore's protege, which I don't think a lot of people know, actually. But he in a lot of ways is, and I think in a lot of ways is a disciple, or began maybe more as a disciple of Alan Moore and has sort of moved in a very different direction, I think. Neil Gaiman, I should note, was, as a young man, one of my absolute favorite writers, if not my absolute favorite writer. I adored, I guess I should explain, the first trade paperback of a graphic novel I ever bought was Marvel 1602. And that was the thing that made me really into comics. I was already a little into comics, but that was the thing that really got me into it. And which of course is by Neil Gaiman, I should note. Marvel 1602 being a complete grounds-up reimagining of the Marvel Universe, as if the characters lived in the year 1602. And is also so much more than that. It has weird twists and turns. There's a bizarre twist halfway through that I'm not going to spoil, because even though the book came out so long ago, there's a lot of people who still don't know about it. And I highly recommend 1602. It's not perfect by any means. A lot of people don't like it as much as I do, but I think it's really good. I think it's really, really good. And one thing about Marvel 1602 is you can tell if you read it that Neil Gaiman is a man with a strong interest in, like, fiction and myths and legends and things like that, and that he very much sort of approaches superhero stuff when he writes it like that. This is not a superhero story. This is, I'm reviewing, like I said, I think, two short stories by him. These are A Study in Emerald and Snow Glass Apples, which is a title that I constantly forget, because I'm going to be honest with you, I like the story. I don't think the title is very good. It's definitely indicative of the story that, you know, he wrote, but it's not like notably, it's not really indicative of the story. I'm going to talk about it. These are two stories that I often see paired together because they're both Neil Gaiman short stories. They, I think, at one point were both freely available on the internet through his website. Nowadays, only A Study in Emerald is. And I think you actually have to buy the book that these were published in to read Snow Glass Apples. I'm going to talk about these in the order that I read them. And I read both of these years ago, but I'm going to talk about A Study in Emerald first because I read it first. A Study in Emerald is, well, it's worth noting that this story, because just as a heads up, by the way, I will spoil both of these. A Study in Emerald has some great twists. It's generally best if you go into it not knowing much about it, but even if you do, it's a lot of fun. And I'm going to spoil the shit out of it. From what I understand from the interview with Neil Gaiman I saw related to A Study in Emerald, he said that he was asked to contribute a story to an anthology called Shadows Over Baker Street, which is a collection of stories combining the worlds of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle and H.P. Lovecraft. But Gaiman thought that was a dumb idea because even though Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was himself a believer in spiritualism and the supernatural, famously, if you look into it, as he got older, he got more and more sort of obsessed with the idea of like witchcraft and seances and ghosts and stuff. The Sherlock Holmes stories themselves generally remain within the realm of you know, reality and science as it existed at the time. And while some more modern adaptations try to basically make it like an urban fantasy thing, Sherlock Holmes is very much a character driven by like facts and logic. He's a little bit like in traditional Judeo-Christian values, Watson, these clues indicate that the cultural Marxists are attempting to steal the money from the Queen. Yeah. Obvious joke, I know, but I don't know. It came up. A Study in Emerald is Gaiman's attempt to rectify this inherently bizarre mashup that is clearly written because these are two things that have shared fandom. But Gaiman approaches A Study in Emerald from a perspective not of having Sherlock Holmes encounter something that doesn't fit within logic, but to have the world of Sherlock Holmes be a world lacking logic fundamentally in the way that Lovecraft does, so that a detective who exists in a universe like this, who is a detective in the same way that Sherlock Holmes is, would have a different sense of what is logical and reasonable, and that's where A Study in Emerald comes from. And as a result of that, it's the only story from Shadows Over Baker Street anyone knows, and was republished in Gaiman's short story collection Fragile Things. Obviously is available online. It has a graphic novel adaptation, which was drawn by Raphael Albuquerque, Raphael Scavone, and Dave Stewart. Those are the three who adapted it. There's also a board game adaptation. It won a Hugo Award and a Locus Award. It's wonderful. Now, I'm going to discuss what went into A Study in Emerald, the plot of this, and the different sort of implications and references within it. But it's very much worth noting that I'm not, contrary to what people may believe, or not believe, based on the kind of stuff I make, an expert on all of these things. I am by no means a Sherlock Holmes expert. I'm by no means a Lovecraft expert. And I'm not an expert on most of these things, though I'm moderately familiar with both Holmes and Lovecraft. And obviously, I'm more familiar with some of the other things that are referenced in this. And so that's very much worth noting. This is also, interestingly, Gaiman's foray into the world of, like, there's not really a title for this type of fiction that I'm aware of. It is sometimes referred to, I guess, as crossover fiction. I consider this sort of crisis crossover, massive crossover, mashup fiction, in the vein of something like League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which Gaiman cited as an influence, alongside the two other things that Gaiman cited as influences on this story: Philip Jose Farmer's The Walt Newton Universe, and Kim Newman's Anno Dracula series, which I've brought up a lot. But Anno Dracula is by Kim Newman, who is friends with Neil Gaiman, and who Neil Gaiman helped plot out the first Anno Dracula book with Newman. That's just a fun little bit of backstory, and Gaiman, so this is him dipping his toes into that world. So, A Study in Emerald, if you read it in the form that you can find online as the PDF, which I will link, I should note, it is in the format of a newspaper, and very much of the Times newspaper. There is an ad for a play, and the ad talks about the crowned heads of Europe, the Royal Court Theatre, Drury Lane, and the three plays which are being presented are My Look-alike Brother Tom, The Littlest Violet Seller, and The Great Old Ones Come, this last an historical epic of pageantry and delight. This instantly sets the tone of this story, as does the headline at the top, which says The Star of Albion, and has a giant star with an eyeball on it, and I think you maybe know sort of where this is going. This is a story about a veteran of a war in Afghanistan who has returned home to England, disabled due to his wounds that he took, and this is obviously the same setup as Watson in the Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet, which is what this is named in reference to. That's the very first Sherlock Holmes story that introduces the characters, has them meet, and introduces the world to Sherlock Holmes and to Watson. But he notes that in Afghanistan, which is where he was fighting, he fought monsters. And this is regarded as being generally pretty normal, but still deeply traumatizing. So our friend, this veteran, finds lodging with a man who is a consulting detective. Inspector Lestrade from the Sherlock Holmes stories is still here and recommends that the two live together. And the consulting detective who he meets is a man, who just like Sherlock Holmes can instantly recognize like everything about you based on small clues, the mud on your boots, the way your shirt is pressed and folded, things like that. Really impressive sort of guesswork. And note that, by the way, that I'm not saying Holmes and Watson. That is a spoiler, just the fact that I'm referring to them that way. But I'm going to leave it up in the air until we get there. So these two have begun living together, and they begin solving mysteries. And one thing about this that I should note is this is in a lot of ways just, at least begins as a retelling of A Study in Scarlet. They both feature a mysterious murder, and sort of on the wall, scrawled in blood, the word Rache, which is German for revenge. The body that they find, though, is not a human body. It is a body. Well, let's first focus on the blood. It is described as bile green to grass green. It had soaked into the threadbare carpet and spattered the wallpaper. I imagined it for one moment the work of some hellish artist who had decided to create a study in emerald. Lestrade immediately is like, well, it's obviously he's going to write the word Rachel because he's writing a woman's name. And not Sherlock Holmes is like, you're fucking stupid. I'm Sherlock Holmes, and I know better than you because I'm Sherlock Holmes. You're wrong. You're stupid. And we learn that this character who has been murdered, it says the corpse is obviously not that of a man, the color of his blood, the number of limbs, the eyes, the position of the face. All these things bespeak the blood royal. And we learn that this is Prince Franz Drago of Bohemia. He was here as a guest of Her Majesty Victoria in Albion, it should know. This is Britain, and this is consistently referred to as Albion. For those who maybe don't know, Albion is an archaic word for the British Isles, and it is often used in like fantasy works, like Fable, or as like an alternative history name for Britain. And it should be noted that English people, and well, I guess British people in general, and also Americans, do use the term Albion, or they did at this time in history, the 17 and 1800s, as like a fancy name for Great Britain that has basically fallen to the wayside. Interestingly enough, I learned that early Americans used to call the British Empire Perfidious Albion, which is a great insult. Not really, but it sounds cool. Perfidious Albion. What we learn from here, the characters have to go meet with the Queen. It's also mentioned that the Prince, Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, who is in real life German, or was in real life German, was a member of the German royal family. We meet him in the next scene, and he is notably just a human man. The Queen, however, is not. And this is one of the best portions of this entire story, one of my favorite excerpts from it, one that I have never forgotten ever since I first read this story. She was called Victoria because she had beaten us in battle 700 years before. And she was called Gloriana because she was glorious. And she was called the Queen because the human mouth was not shaped to say her true name. And Queen Victoria in this consistently her dialogue is written in untraditional ways. It's not put in quotation marks. It's all spelt strangely in sort of a phonetic way. Clearly, Queen Victoria here is not a person. She is, in fact, some form of great old one. The characters go to see the play that is mentioned at the beginning. And essentially, and this isn't immediately, of course, the detective is doing disguise work. He's doing general Sherlock Holmes things that Sherlock Holmes does, dressing up in costumes, being a silly guy, you know what I mean, dressing in drag, which would get him, if the government of Tennessee gets their way, thrown in prison, just as a note. So they would really do that to Sherlock Holmes. And they go to see the show because it's part of Sherlock's kind of hunch. He knows where it's going. What do you guys think about this, by the way, the Schneiders?
And modern comedy changed after Chris Rock.
I write hat of spoons, and we get...
Yeah, you guys said it. That's great. Anyway, so it's 3 plays, like I mentioned. The first, at the beginning. So the first 2 plays that are performed are just standard kind of plays, just like, one's a comic play, a comedy with songs and all that, mistaken identities. It sounds like basically every play from this era. The second is about a little girl who is sad and dies because she's poor, and that's what the other thing plays are about. And then the third is a rousing historical narrative where the great old ones rise from R'lyeh and dim Carcosa and the plains of Lang and conquer the entirety of Great Britain, and it is noted the rest of the world. It says here, the heroines sang a haunting aria, whilst in an astonishing display of magic lantern trickery, it seemed as if we saw their shadows across the sky at the back of the stage, the Queen of Albion herself, the Black One of Egypt, followed by the ancient goat, parent to 1,000, emperor of all China, and the Tsar unanswerable, and he who presides over the New World, and the White Lady of the Antarctic fastness, and the others. So anyway, after the play ends, they want to meet with one of the actors, Sherry Vernette. And Sherry Vernette comes out. He's the actor. He is, a very talented actor, they note. And he smokes a big, strong black shag. And the detective is pretending to be a theater recruiter and getting in contact with this guy, doing like a pretty standard sort of detective thing where you pretend to be just like not a normal guy. He's doing a thing where he's ingratiating himself to the person who they suspect, in a sense, by talking about shared interests, stuff like that, establishing trust. Because as we learn, our detective is already pretty certain of what's going on. He mentions the curiosity of the limping doctor. Because, and this is interesting, he knew basically immediately, based on the footprints, who was in that room. The great old one was murdered. If you know anything about Sherlock Holmes, you probably are noticing the limping doctor, and that's because you got it. The limping doctor is Dr. Watson, and the man that is the actor who they just met is Sherlock Holmes. The two of them have just murdered a great old one, and so that just happened, is what a millennial would say reading this story. And anyway, ultimately, the story from here wraps up pretty concisely. It's mentioned that these characters are what's called restorationists. They are those who do not believe that the coming of the great old ones was a good thing, the fine thing we all know it to be, as they mention. They are essentially anarchists within this universe, and we learn that the men who we've met are restorationists, and there is an attached letter, and if you read it, it's pretty obvious that the people doing it are Sherlock Holmes and Watson, and the detective and his associate kind of are resigned, because also like I said, they leave a note that's basically like, yeah, I already know who you are and I figured everything out and I'm smarter than you. And ultimately, we're left with the characters being somewhat unsettled, just because of the fact that it seems like since this all happened, the author notes, things seem to be going in a direction that makes it seem like maybe things are heating up. They mention recent events in Russia, which, given that this is dated London, New Albion, 1881, means that it would probably be the assassination of Alexander II in Russia, the Tsar Alexander II, who was blown up by nihilists. And this is signed S.M. Major Retired Baker Street. So, obviously, this is a story dealing with a perspective flip of a standard Sherlock Holmes story, while also being set within this crazy, mashed up, mixed up world of Sherlock Holmes and Lovecraft. I should note there's a few other references in here, which is one of the reasons I decided to talk about it, because one of the references is to the thing I always talk about, which is Dracula. So there are ads throughout this, and the first is it's an ad for Victor's Vitae, which would be a fluid made by a man who is very heavily implied to be Victor Frankenstein, which re-energizes your limbs and nether regions back to life. So he's bringing you the dead parts of your body back to life with his Vitae. Then we have an ad for Jekyll's Powders, which is brings out the inner you, the real you. We have Professional Exsanguator V. Tepes, or Zepesh, as it notes. You've tried the rest, now try the best. And also, yeah, it's just, there's a little ad of someone who is drawn to look like Vlad the Impaler. It's obviously supposed to be Vlad Tepes. And then we get an ad at the end, which is sort of an odd man out, because it's an ad for Spring Heel Jack's shoes, his shoe store, which is funny, and I like, but Spring Heel Jack is not like a literary character in the same sense. Spring Heel Jack, by the way, in case anyone doesn't know, it's hard to call him a cryptid, but it's kind of hard to call him anything else. Spring Heel Jack was a phenomenon from Victorian England, who was a being who was sighted around menacing people. It was incredibly popular at the time. It inspired a number of works of fiction. There's a number of different theories about who Spring Heel Jack could have been, what Spring Heel Jack could have been. People have said anything from, like, a bored rich man to a fucking alien. But Spring Heel Jack's, a very interesting character, and has been alternatively characterized as, like, a forerunner to everything from, like, Batman to other sort of, like, slasher characters. It's Spring Heel Jack's a really interesting character. People should use him in more things, and I'm happy he shows up, even if it's in a minor sense, in this. In terms of other references, like I noted, obviously the murderers of this story, the antagonists, but honestly the heroes, are obvious. Well, it's Sherlock Holmes and Watson, obviously, but our protagonists are incredibly heavily implied, and not just heavily implied, like it's there's no other answer. It's definitely these guys. There are Colonel Sebastian, or I guess Major Sebastian Moran, as he's called in this, and Professor Moriarty, who are two Sherlock Holmes villains. Obviously, everyone knows Moriarty. Moran is less well known, but Moran is essentially Moriarty's equivalent of a Watson-type figure, who's also a member of the military who has been in some way disabled. So that's why they are able to do the fake out. But there's like a number of mentions. Sherlock Holmes in the note mentions having read Dimensions of an Asteroid, which is a book that it's mentioned that Moriarty wrote in the original Sherlock Holmes stories. And, and this whole story, I mean, it is similar to Anno Dracula more than probably anything else, because Anno Dracula is the story of a Great Britain conquered by Dracula, in which the paranormal forces have sort of emerged into the public. The difference being that in this, the Great Old Ones have ruled since the, Middle Ages, and because if it's 1888 and they say they've ruled for roughly 700 years, they Great Old Ones would have ruled since 1100s, which, yeah, that's a long time to rule. It seems here that not only are creatures from Victorian sort of nightmares, the horror fiction that kept Victorian people up at night and entertained them, are just a common occurrence. Victor's Vitae, like I mentioned, you can buy Jekyll's powder. This is an incredibly interesting setup for a world, because not only is it a world ruled by the Great Old Ones, but it's also essentially an alternate reality, an alternate universe to all of Victorian fiction. Gaiman has described this as fan fiction, and it is undeniably. That's not to put it down by any means, but that is what it is. And it's interesting that he essentially created a thing that is both a massive crossover, a mirror universe, and just like an alternate reality. And it's very interesting because the heroes are the villains are the heroes. Sherlock Holmes is essentially either leading or a member of the resistance. It seems like all of these monsters that were usually resigned to the shadows and the nightmares and the closets and under your bed are now just, respectable businessmen in society. And there's something really fascinating about that. I really like that as a concept. And it's also worth noting that anarchism and stuff like that was not necessarily as big a scare as, like, you know, the Red Scare was later after the Second World War, but, like, it was a thing that people were aware of. There were anarchists at the time, and at the time, anarchists in Europe especially, but also in America, and elsewhere, obviously, as well, there were anarchists all over, were less like anarchists today, and they were a little bit more like people, like, sort of cliched anarchists. Famously, you know, obviously the nihilists who killed Alexander II were basically anarchists, though the Russian nihilists are sort of a different thing. I don't need to get too into that, but an anarchist, Leon Kolgash, killed President McKinley? Yeah, he killed McKinley. I couldn't remember if it was Garfield or McKinley, but he did kill McKinley, because it was Charles Guiteau. Charles Guiteau killed President Garfield. President McKinley was killed by Kolgash. Kolgash killed him to spread awareness for anarchist causes. It's not a great plan. And then Guiteau killed Garfield because Garfield was eating all of the country's lasagna. And so, you know, he's tying it in, like I mentioned, the war in Afghanistan. There's a reference to what is seemingly the assassination of Alexander II, all that kind of stuff. Gaiman is really having not just fun, but he's tying it into the real world to show that in order for this story to work, everything has to be pretty well the same. You know, the names are different, the reasons behind things are different, but it's a mirror of our own reality instead of a completely different thing. It's a parallel universe. It's a mirror universe, which is what I think of this as being more than anything else. This is not, really best described as anything other than a mirror universe story, which is unique to it. Nothing else has done that with this kind of crossover fiction. Anno Dracula has some elements of it, but most of the heroes in Anno Dracula are heroes in their original work, and most of the villains are villains in their original work, whereas the moralities aren't different, but their standing within society here is changed. And so it's, it'd be interesting to note, what does the rest of this world look like? Gaiman has discussed writing a sequel. There's no news about that, but he has stated that he knows who what the title would be, who the main character would be, but he hasn't written it, which is a shame. I would love to see a take on more of this universe. And I did mention, I think briefly at the beginning, that there is a board game based on this. I've never played it. I don't know much about it. I know that it is essentially, seemingly, a game where half the players are in the Resistance and half the players are working for the Great Old Ones, and they don't know who's who, and they're working against each other. And it's one of those board games that's like, probably not to the same extent, but it's a little bit like something like Betrayal at House on the Hill, where there's procedural elements based on like card draws and stuff, and that's cool. I like those kinds of board games when I do play board games. But honestly, I'd love to see an RPG set in this world. I think that'd be amazing. I have thought about running an RPG in this world multiple times. I want to know what other characters from Victorian fiction and later, because obviously the Lovecraft stuff's not really Victorian, it's more Edwardian. But I want to know, what does this world do to those people? What is Van Helsing up to? What is the Invisible Man up to? Griffin isn't mentioned at all in this. What? I don't know. I'm trying to think of other characters from that era. We don't get Jack the Ripper in this, which is probably good because Anno Dracula is all about Jack the Ripper, so that's probably why I didn't deal with it. But yeah, and I want to know more about even like some of the characters he's already mentioned, like Jekyll and Dracula and stuff like that. I mean, it's just there's so much more to do in this world, and I want to see the fall of the Great Old Ones. I want to see what happens. I want to see more of this world. And as it is right now, we can only imagine, and there are imaginings of that. There is there's a piece of art by an artist online named Bruce Monroe, who makes maps for alternate history stories and sometimes fantasy stories, and is a bit of a writer in his own right. But Bruce Monroe has a map, a hypothetical, pretty detailed map, based on sort of his interpretation of like what the world of A Study in Emerald looks like. It's pretty cool. I can link to that as well. And yeah, no, I mean, it's set your brain in motion. You want to know what's going to happen. So, A Study in Emerald of these two is the better story, in my opinion. I think they're both very good. I think, I say that, thinking out loud, I think A Snow Glass Apple might be better written, but I think that A Study in Emerald is more interesting. I think it's ultimately more creative, it's more unique, and it has so much... It's more fun to read because it gets your brain going about potentials, and the other story that we're going to talk to doesn't have as much of that. There's not as much ambiguity, there's not as much open to interpretation, and there's just not as much to really sink your teeth into. But I do actually have a bit to say about it, so I'm going to talk about that. But before I do you guys have anything to say about it, Schneiders? The two of you? I know you guys have been very talkative during this episode. But do you guys have any thoughts on A Study in Emerald?
Get in that kitchen and start making sauce!
The love of countries comes up first and foremost. We love this place. We want to continue and expand its freedoms and continue them for our kids.
Wow, yeah, that's insightful. That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, that does kind of change the way I look at it. Anyway, Snow Glass Apples has a less interesting backstory, I would say, too, to be honest with you as well. Snow Glass Apples was written as benefit for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which is a thing that I've always been a little bit confused by, but it's essentially a nonprofit organization to protect freedom of speech specifically for comic book writers, and among the people who, it has a lot of kind of comic book writers involved in it. I know that Jeff Smith, who did Bone, Frank Miller, Bill Hader, according to Wikipedia at least, are all people who've talked about it, though I'm sure that's true. I know Bill Hader has talked about comics quite a bit, even though he's the star of Barry, and not a comic book writer. But I guess this was essentially just established to deal with a comic book comic book store owner who was arrested because he was selling things that were deemed obscene, a bunch of sort of underground comics. Some of them were like erotic comics. I think they were almost all erotic comics, or just like, kind of gonzo underground comics, like R. Crumb and stuff like that. Yeah, and I know there's controversy amongst them. They're not like they're not actually that good an organization in a lot of ways. I don't want to say too much because I don't quite know enough about them. But I know that there is some stuff with them defending both like problematic people and people within the movement themselves being problematic, like people within the leadership. But ultimately, I do support the concept, obviously, of defending people's right, as much as like the first. This is I guess a detour, and I'm going to get back on topic. But as much as like the First Amendment in the U.S. and the right to free speech in most other places. has become sort of like a right-wing talking point. It is important in general, even as like from the perspective of someone like me who's like much more left-wing. You know, freedom of speech is ultimately important. It's just that it doesn't always get used properly. I'm not going to get into it. I try to stay pretty apolitical with this show. So, Snow Glass Apples was written anyway to raise money for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, and was later republished in other things. This one also won awards, though I think it was specifically just the comic book adaptation by Colleen Doran. And it won the 2020 Eisner Award for Best Adaptation from Another Medium, and it also got a Bram Stoker Award, that comic in particular, which is, the Bram Stoker Award is a horror comics. Not always, but how do I put it? The Bram Stoker Awards is just for horror in general, but they specifically gave it a graphic novel version of a Bram Stoker Award. Not important. Ultimately, this is a story about vampires, which is why I'm talking about it specifically. And because it, in a lot of ways, it is dealing with a lot of the same stuff from a meta-contextual level as Study in Emerald. This is, by the way, going to be an episode where I say some annoying things like meta-contextual. And I talk about, like, Philip Jose Farmer, which I already did. But yeah. Anyway, this is a story. This one's much easier to just explain and recap. This is a retelling of Snow White from the perspective of the stepmother. I guess a little bit like something like Wicked by Gregory Maguire and the musical based on Wicked. I'll admit that I've never read Wicked, but I've heard great things about the book, and some of the songs from the musical are kind of good, but I'm not really a musical theater person. But that book seems interesting, and I'll probably read it. Gregory Maguire seems like an interesting writer. Anyway, it's a little bit like that, where it's told from the perspective of the character who's traditionally the villain. One of my favorite examples of this was actually, if anyone remembers, Team Star Kid, who did a Harry Potter musical, which is so embarrassing in retrospect. But hey, I was in middle school once. They did a parody of Wicked and also Aladdin called Twisted, which was the story of Aladdin from the perspective of Jafar, specifically like musical Aladdin. Or not musical, Disney Aladdin, from the perspective of Jafar. And I remember Twisted being very funny. I think if I went back to it, it might not hold up, although it might. I don't know. But I remember it being really funny. Anyway, this is like that, except that instead of being really funny or a musical, it's deeply fucking disturbing. I don't give trigger warnings ever in this show, but trigger warning for a lot of things, including incest, pedophilia, necrophilia, and more. So, heads up about that, everybody. But again, I don't normally give trigger warnings on things, but just thought I would do it here, because, oh boy. So, the premise with this essentially is, and I should know the format for this is told from the perspective of the wicked stepmother. Or I guess not the wicked stepmother, the evil queen. The wicked stepmother is Cinderella's stepmother. They're the same character, basically, except one of them's a queen and one of them's just some bitch. It doesn't matter. But the stepmother is essentially like a witch or a sorcerer of some kind. She has had magical powers seemingly just from birth as a natural thing. She can see the future, and she ends up marrying a king. He kind of claims her as like a right of kings thing, a sort of prima nocta, although she does seem also to kind of like be into it, which is worth noting. And he basically has her come live in his house, or in the palace, I should say. as his wife, but they have separate rooms, and they mostly just hang out when they want to sleep together. But it's also worth noting that the king has a daughter from the original queen, who it stated died giving birth to her. And this is the child, who is a vampire. She's got skin as pale as snow, as white as snow. She's got dark hair, big ruby red lips. And, one night she goes into the queen's room and bites her fucking hand and starts drinking her blood. But she's a vampire in an interesting way. And I like always, I'll get a little bit into vampire lore with this, but I really like this take because she's not in any way a traditional vampire, and it makes her scarier. It's noted that when she bites the stepmother's hand, the wounds heal very, very quickly. They're gone within like a day. And so it's really cool that, like, the idea that essentially not only is she magical, but in some way her bite is also magical on you, which is so cool. Anyway, so this is where big trigger warning, stop right now if you don't want to hear about this shit, which again, I'm not going to normally do, but I just feel like I want to do it for the story. The king gets killed by essentially being raped to death by his 6-year-old daughter. Hey, Dan Schneider in particular, just Dan, not Rob, just Dan, what do you think about this?
I will tase her if necessary.
Yeah, okay, cool, man, whatever, that's great. So, specifically, she's just bitten him everywhere, but they do make a mention that she bit, the down there regions. This is, I should note, not played in any way to be like arousing. Obviously, it's played to be scary. And both the short story and the graphic novel do not show any of this and are very tasteful about it. But anyway, now the queen is the queen. The stepmother is the queen. And the stepmother sends out the huntsman to kill Snow White and cut out her heart. And it's mentioned that unlike in the actual Snow White story, she actually does get Snow White's heart, and it's definitely Snow White's heart. But it still beats after being removed, which is so sick. And she actually hangs it in her private chambers because the idea essentially is that she, as long as that heart is beating, she knows that Snow White is still alive out there. And Snow White is living out in the forest with the 7 dwarves, who aren't referred to as dwarves, but they are it's the 7 dwarves. And it's mentioned that like the woods are full of all of these like bizarre creatures, or not creatures, that feels wrong. It almost seems like this society is just exiling anyone who is like not normal in terms of their genetics or their appearance, which is fucked up, but isn't really elaborated on. But that is sort of what the Queen's dialogue implies. So, and also it seems that the Snow White is probably using her like vampiric abilities to manipulate the 7 dwarves, possibly sexually. And so the Queen uses a magic spell. She does blood magic to create enchanted apples, which she brings into the woods. Which, by the way, I've been playing the Dragon Age games recently, and they talk about blood magic a lot in those. And I like the word blood magic. It's a sick in multiple senses phrase. Anyway, Snow White eats one of the apples, dies, and the heart stops beating. But then 2 years later, this prince from another village visits, and their kingdoms are going to get united, because it's weird that she is the queen, I should note. I'll get into it after I finish the synopsis. The prince is very obviously a necrophiliac. He keeps telling the queen to sit still and not move and try not to breathe and not talk, and he still can't do it. She mentions that he has a small limp penis, which great. And he ends up, running away because he's kind of embarrassed. And he's going home. And what does he find but the corpse of Snow White? And he proceeds to buy it, or possibly intimidate the seven dwarves into letting him buy it. And then he, trigger warning, rapes the corpse, which brings her back to life because he somehow dislodges the piece of the apple stuck in Snow White's throat, which is, to be clear, what the original fairy tale does. But in the original fairy tale, it's a kiss. Which would still be creepy in this context. Let me be clear, you shouldn't be kissing a corpse. But, regardless, the prince and Snow White go back to the kingdom. They sentence her to death for witchcraft. And it's also noted early in the story, there's a mention that they talk about, every year we have these festivities. We cook a roast pork in goose fat. So they leave the queen in the dungeons for a long time. They drag her out, strip all her clothes off, shave her completely bald, cover her in goose fat, and shove her in the kiln. And it's revealed that this entire story is her thoughts as she's dying. And she is trying not to scream, so she can't give them the satisfaction. Because now everyone's fucked. And that's Snow Glass Apples, a great family-friendly story. I have a strong stomach, generally, for things like this. The story doesn't particularly disturb me, I should note. But I can acknowledge that these are all disturbing concepts. I earlier today was telling my roommate, who I often bounce ideas for this podcast off of, about this story, and he'd never heard of it. So I was describing it to him, and after I finished, he went, "Jesus, Neil Gaiman wrote that?" And I said, "Yep." Because this is very... Neil Gaiman is not a guy I would normally describe as, an edgelord. And I don't know if this is an edgelord story. It's supposed to be a horror story. It succeeds at being a horror story. I think it does its job well, and I think the edginess of it is very much deserved. But, still, it's a lot. But it works for what it is. Also, like I mentioned, there is a graphic novel comic book adaptation of this, which I read recently, and is pretty good. The artwork in it is not really my thing normally, but I got used to it as I was reading it, and by the end of it, I thought it fit. It's very, how do I put it? I don't like the coloring a whole lot, and I should note, I've read both graphic novels adaptations. They're just the story. Just in every single way, they're just the story. I think, honestly, as a graphic novel, Snow Glass Apples kind of works better. It's cool to see everything. It's much more, it's almost experimental at points. It's all drawn to look like it's all drawn to sort of look like medieval, or more so like throwbacks to medieval art. It's very cool the way it's done. And I really like the designs for all the characters. I like the way that Snow White is drawn. I like the way that the Queen is drawn. Like the dwarves. It's just, there's some really cool stuff in there. But I do want to analyze it a little bit, because that's what I do here with these stories. Making Snow White a vampire seems like a really novel concept, but I learned while doing research that Neil Gaiman did not originate that idea, unfortunately. It's actually seemingly, I don't even know if it's original from here. There's another short story called Red as Blood by, who is this by? Tanith Lee, who's a deceased British author. And Tanith Lee, who was she was a science fiction fantasy author. She wrote 2 episodes of the show Blake's 7. That's cool. I've never seen Blake's 7, but I know of it. Blake 7, real quick, is like a BBC show from back in the day that is like, people often say now that Andor is out, that Andor is cribbing a lot from Blake 7. I don't know how much of that's true. I've never seen Blake 7, but it seems like there's definitely some parallels. Anyway, Red is Blood is a short story by her. I'm going to admit that I can't find it. And I kind of wish I could read it. It seems cool. And it's from a book that she wrote that is a collection of a bunch of retellings of fairy tales, and everyone is set like in a different point in time, and there's like, I don't know, it seems cool. I do kind of want to check it out, to be honest with you, but I don't know where it can be found. But I mean, you can probably buy it online, which maybe I will do. I don't know. Not important. That is apparently the thing that originated the concept of Snow White as a vampire, and sort of not just having her as a vampire, but kind of around that building, like, you know, the idea of the seven dwarves being kind of scary. And I don't know much about the plot of it, though, so maybe it's different. I'm sure it's probably a very different story. But anyway, other things worth noting about it, like I said, the vampire mythology of it's very cool. The idea, and I mean, what's really interesting about it is that it's not rebuilding the story of Snow White around vampirism. It's rebuilding vampirism around the story of Snow White. In most works of vampire fiction, the heart is definitively a weakness for vampires. It's one of the most consistent weaknesses in vampire fiction, if not like the most consistent. A stake through the heart that kills a vampire. Everyone knows that. Her whole ass heart gets cut out and she's fine. She's still walking around with it. And that is really interesting because it's building on the story of Snow White, where she's supposed to have her heart cut out, although in the original story she doesn't get her heart cut out. Other things I really think are interesting about it, like I mentioned, the bites healing really quickly is creepy and cool. The fact that she ages, but is born a vampire is creepy and really interesting. I've seen a little bit of speculation about what she might be. It's noted that she doesn't look like either of her parents, so some people have speculated that her mother was in some way like impregnated by a vampire, and that Snow White is like a Dhampir or something, or like a new form of vampire. It's not important, is the thing. She's just a scary kid, and honestly, this would be, I don't know how you would do it. Someone make Snow Glass Apples into a movie. I don't know how you do it. Make it kind of artsy. Don't make it like a movie that's going to be like popular or in theaters. Make it like an A24 film. Actually, I say that unironically, this would be a great A24 film. And you don't have to show any of the, obviously stuff you can't show. But you can go pretty close to the line. You can be pretty edgy and disturbing. And I think that if A24 made this into a movie and it was good, people would fucking lose their minds. Like, in a good way. Even people who don't know who Neil Gaiman is, because people would be like, oh, there's a horror movie version of Snow White, I bet that's going to suck, and then they watch it and they're like, Jesus Christ, this is really cool. That doesn't exist, but hypothetically, it would be a cool adaptation for A24 to do. I know they don't do adaptations a lot in general. They do some, though. Not important, but they did the Green Knights, I think. That's them. And that's a fantasy thing, so they could do it. Like I said, I don't have as much to say about Snow Glass Apples other than that I really like it. I know that like dark fairy tale reimagining is an incredibly played out thing. It's kind of lame at this point because everyone does it, including Disney, who are the people who it was basically initially done in reaction to in a lot of ways. But they've done, obviously, like Once Upon a Time, which is a dog shit show. from what I watched of it. To be clear, it might get better. It probably doesn't. I don't believe it does. But they also did like some other stuff in that vein. I know they have like novels, like YA novels that are kind of like that. I'm not a Disney person, to be clear, so I don't really give a shit about that. But I think once they got to the point, it's like, okay, guys, I don't need more. I don't need more of these for now. But every so often, someone does a dark fairy tale reimagining that kicks ass. And this is one that kicks ass. And it's like superhero fatigue, where it's only fatiguing when the shit is like either like kind of mid or just bad, right? But when something is good and you like enjoy it and you're like, damn, this is like inspired and cool, then yeah, you can do something generic or like played out like a dark fairy tale reimagining. So yeah, I mean, I really like this story. I've loved the idea of Vampire Snow White ever since I read it. I've wanted to use that in something. And knowing that Neil Gaiman didn't originate it is cool. So anyone who's listening to this, who's like a writer or an artist or something, feel free to draw Vampire Snow White or make a story or a movie or a show or something with Vampire Snow White, because Neil Gaiman also didn't come up with the idea, so anyone can use it. Yeah, no, I think this is a really cool story, and I think they're both really good. And I like I said, I didn't talk much about the graphic novel adaptation of A Study in Emerald. I keep almost calling it a study in A Study in Scarlet, which is the original title, but the graphic novel for that, the art is better, I think, but I don't know if it's better. It's more kind of what I like in art generally, but I don't think it's as good. I haven't reread it in a while, to be clear. I read it at a library, but I remember thinking that it was more pointless. Whereas, like I said, I think that Snow Glass Apples is enhanced by being a graphic novel. Which is cool. Schneiders, you got anything to leave off with? Anything?
And I'm talking about the sauce!
If Joe Biden was a dog, you'd put him down.
Haha, great stuff, guys. Anyway, this has been your DracCast for this week. Everybody have a good time. If you see Neil Gaiman, tell him that he should come on the show. Neil Gaiman is not... I'm kidding, obviously. Neil Gaiman is too busy fucking. I guess I should... It's not really important. It's the man's personal life, but he talked about it. Neil Gaiman fucks a lot. And I think that's sick. I'm very happy for Neil. I love Neil. Neil Gaiman also, like I said, one of my favorite writers when I was young. Still love Neil Gaiman. I love, obviously Sandman is awesome. Sandman TV show, also awesome. Watch that if you haven't. And then I like a lot of his fiction. I like The Graveyard Book a lot, and Nancy Boys. I remember really liking American Gods. It was it was pretty interesting. I haven't read all of them. I haven't read what's that one he did? Neverwhere? I haven't read Neverwhere. I know things about it, but I haven't read it. None of that's important. Oh, and also he created Angela, who was from Spawn, but is now a Marvel character. And I like Angela well enough. Shout out to Angela. And there's a bunch of photos of him with Kat Dennings, who, if you know anything about me, I like Kat Dennings a lot. So that's pretty cool. But yeah. Anyway, I'm gonna let everyone go. Me and the Schneiders are signing off. Next week, I'm gonna talk about. I don't know. I have no idea yet. Okay, bye.